Welcome back. In our last session, we looked at the second half of the Passion narrative, beginning with the Roman trial and the Barabbas scene. After that, we analyzed the material pertaining to the scourging, the way of the cross, or the Via Dolorosa, and finally, we looked at the crucifixion scene with the death of Jesus. In our current and final session of this study of the Gospel of Matthew, we will look at the events following Jesus' death, namely, the burial scene of Jesus, while at the same time examining burial customs. Then we'll turn to the narrative of the empty tomb, which is found in Matthew's Gospel. This will be followed by a look at the report of the soldiers that were sent to guard the tomb of Jesus. We shall end our study of Matthew with an analysis of the Great Commission of Jesus to his disciples. Immediately after Jesus dies, a number of unusual phenomena occur. These events are seen to be apocalyptic occurrences, showing that the definite new age is beginning. The veil of the temple sanctuary, the second or innermost curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the holy place, was torn in two from top to bottom. This is a sign that the division between God and God's people has been eliminated. The tear from top to bottom implies that it's the doing of God and not a human being. Matthew then goes on to note that the earth shook, perhaps as a prelude to the rising of the dead, about to be described, according to Harrington. Then, with the splitting of the rocks, the bodies of the saints were raised, coming out of their tombs and entering and appearing to many in the city. This apocalyptic fragment may have been added by Matthew to show that the death of Jesus and his resurrection will make possible the resurrection of others. Brown concludes that Matthew wants to communicate that the death and resurrection of Jesus marked the beginning of the last times. Then the reaction of those charged with the execution of Jesus is described. The centurion and those with him, when they saw these events, feared greatly. Then they announced, "Truly, this was a Son of God." There was something divine about him, that in the moment of his death such wondrous things happened. Implicit in that statement is the acknowledgement that Jesus was more than likely innocent, and the Romans were wrong in crucifying him. Hagner notes that this is ironic. The Gentile Romans now admit their wrong rather than the Jews to whom Jesus was sent, as he proclaimed throughout the gospel. In yet another shift of focus, the narrative now turns to those who were witnessing the crucifixion. There were many women looking on from afar. These women had been following him through his ministry and had come to him, with him, to Jerusalem from Galilee. Note, they do not approach the cross, but rather stand at a distance witnessing the events taking place. Then Matthew specifies three of these women, two of them by name: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee, who had appeared earlier in the gospel in the unit on the ambition of James and John. Interestingly, Arnold notes that in other accounts of the crucifixion, this woman is identified with Salome, the sister of Jesus' mother. That would make her Jesus' aunt, and John, the son of Zebedee, Jesus' first cousin. The final scene of the Passion narrative is then described, the burial. Here is a picture of the mosaic of the anointing and burial of Jesus that's located just behind the stone of unction in the Church of the Holy Sepulcher in Jerusalem. Evening now has come, and a man named Joseph, who was described as being rich, a man from Arimathea and a disciple of Jesus. This Joseph approaches Pilate and requests the body of Jesus. Now it was usual custom that the bodies of executed criminals not remain on the tree through the night. That custom was even more urgent on this day, as it was both the preparation day for the Sabbath, and this particular Sabbath was a significant one during the celebrations connected with Passover. All the more reason to get the bodies down and buried. Pilate orders that the body be given to Joseph. Now, the normal procedure would have been to wash the body, anoint it with spices, and then wrap it in a linen cloth. Matthew says simply that Joseph simply took the body down from the cross and wrapped it in a linen shroud. The skipping of the washing and the anointing with spices may have been because there was not enough time with the onset of Passover. Having wrapped the body, Joseph laid it in his own tomb, which had been hewn out of rock, then rolled a great stone to the door. A rock-cut tomb usually consisted of two chambers, one for the body, the inner chamber, and one for the mourners, the outer chamber. The entrance to these chambers would be sealed by a rather large rock. That's what Joseph does. He lays the body in the inner chamber and seals the tomb with a rock, and then departs. The burial certainly does not match the death. Jesus died crucified as a common criminal. However, his burial with a linen burial shroud, certainly an expensive item, in a rock-cut tomb which does not come cheap, his burial is that of a king. Matthew ends his record of the burial with a note that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary remained, sitting there facing the tomb. Some of the women who had witnessed the crucifixion now witnessed the burial and remain at the tomb after Joseph and those who had buried Jesus had left. This note prepares the way for Easter morning. These women had witnessed the burial and noted the exact place and exact tomb that Jesus was buried in. Thus, they knew exactly where to come when they returned after the Sabbath to mourn at the tomb on the morning of the first day of the week. This is a picture of the edicule, or the tomb of Jesus as it exists today inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. The first church on this site was built by the Emperor Constantine and dedicated in the year 335. Since then, the church has been destroyed, most significantly in 1009, when it was nearly totally demolished by the Caliph Hakim in his attempt to obliterate and abolish Christianity totally. It's been rebuilt many times since to what it is today. The main door leads into the mourner's chamber, which then leads to where the body of Jesus was laid. That then becomes an altar where Mass can be celebrated. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher we saw in the preceding slide is generally accepted as the burial spot of Jesus in the Catholic Church. However, there's another spot in Jerusalem connected to Gordon's Calvary, which we saw in the last session, which is known as the Garden Tomb, which is pictured here. It's a rock-cut tomb which stands just behind Gordon's Calvary. You can see the rather large entrance to the tomb, and in the center of the picture, the rolling stone which seals the entrance runs on a track just in front of the entrance. Here is a picture of such a rolling stone. Finally, another rock-cut tomb. This one was discovered beneath the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth in Nazareth. Some suspect that it might have been the tomb of Joseph. In any case, it's a good example of a rock-cut tomb with a rolling stone. Here you see the entrance to the tomb with the rolling stone in the open position, allowing mourners to enter. When the stone is rolled to the closed position, denying access, it keeps the tomb sealed and everyone else out. From the size of the entrance, you can imagine how large a stone and how heavy such a rolling stone had to be. The final scene of the Passion narrative in Matthew takes place on the Sabbath. The chief priests and the Pharisees, that is, the leaders of Judaism, approach Pilate yet again. Their concern this time is to preclude a theft of the body that could possibly be construed as resurrection. The fact that these leaders approach Pilate on the Sabbath, and especially this most sacred Sabbath, shows the urgency of their request. They bring a reminiscence of the words of Jesus to Pilate. He said that after 3 days he would be raised up. To prevent such a prophecy from having any semblance of coming true, they asked that the grave of Jesus be secured until the 3rd day had been completed. They're afraid that the followers of Jesus might come and steal the body and then make the proclamation that he had been raised. This last imposture, they say, would be worse than the first. The whole scene is steeped in irony. The claim they put forth from Jesus that he would be raised up after 3 days is what will become the actual kerygma of the early church. And as a result, these very same leaders will have to invent a story that his disciples did indeed steal his body in order to combat that proclamation. Finally, their contention that the last is worse than the first, ironically, is also true, in the sense that the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus brought forth a more positive response to Jesus than his actual ministry could ever have produced. Pilate's response is, "You have a guard," or "the guard is yours," implying that they have the necessary soldiery to secure the tomb. Or, as it is translated here, "the guard is yours. Secure it as best you can." And so the Jewish leaders depart from Pilate and secure the tomb with the soldiers he provided for them. They set a seal on the tomb so they will know if it's been tampered with, and then set a guard to watch the tomb. That sets the scene for the final chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, which begins with the narrative of the empty tomb, which was found by the women when they returned to anoint the body of Jesus after the completion of the Sabbath. The narrative begins noting the time of the event. The first temporal indication given is after the Sabbath. That is, when the Sabbath had concluded. But then Matthew specifies it further, toward the dawn of the first day of the week. It's clearly early on Sunday morning after the crucifixion. Then the women are identified by name: Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Hagner specifies that the other Mary is Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, who was at the cross in Matthew 27:56. They go to see the sepulcher. Hence, they may be coming simply to mourn and offer prayers for the deceased Jesus. But upon their arrival, they experience something which they never expected. Matthew continues, "Behold, a great earthquake." Behold, the Greek idou, which introduces an occurrence which is out of the ordinary. And indeed it is. A great earthquake is quite out of the ordinary. This recalls the earthquake at the death of Jesus. Some feel that it might be an aftershock of the original earthquake. But critical to the narrative is that the earthquake is associated with the descent of an angel from heaven, who came and rolled back the stone of the tomb and sat on it. The angel is then described. His appearance was like lightning, and his raiment, i.e., the clothing that he wore, was white as snow. These are typical apocalyptic descriptions of God. Hence, this angel was a divine messenger sent from God. It's curious that the description is almost exactly the same as the description of the transfigured Christ in chapter 17, too. A reaction and then a further action is narrated. The guards, who had been set by the Jewish leaders, react with fear. Literally, they became like dead men, most likely having fainted from shock. Hagner highlights the irony of this scene. He says the ones assigned to guard the dead themselves appear dead, while the dead one has been made alive. Then the action. The angel addresses the women using typical theophany language, that is, the language of a divine appearance. "Do not be afraid," he says. It's almost an assurance that all is okay. Don't you also become afraid and become like these dead men? This is brought out through the use of the emphatic you in the address. The angel realizes that the women are seeking Jesus, who is now described as the crucified one. Then the angel announces the good news to the women. He is not here, because he has been raised from the dead. Then, with the tomb opened, the women are invited to enter and see the very place where they witnessed him being buried 2 days earlier. It's significant that the good news is stated as he has been raised, the passive voice without an agent. Hence, Jesus has been raised by God. What he had foretold on several occasions during his ministry has now come true. Now the women are given a mission. They are to go quickly and tell his disciples that he's risen from the dead. The message of the good news has been delivered to them by the angel. They are to bring it to the disciples. Hence, they become the first evangelists. Further, they are to inform the disciples that Jesus goes before them to Galilee. There they will see him alive. So the message the women are to deliver is word for word the same message that they've received. The conclusion, "Lo, idou, I have told you," is the final affirmation that this is not a figment of their imagination. Rather, it's a message from God through his messenger, and thus is authoritative. The women respond following the angel's command. They depart from the tomb quickly. Notice the repetition of that adverb throughout this text. Yet they still remain a bit fearful. However, their fear is mixed with great joy. And so, embroiled in these mixed emotions, the women ran to bring the good news to the disciples. Now, faith in the resurrection cannot be based on the fact that Jesus' body was not found in the tomb. The definitive proof that he is risen is the experience of him, an appearance. That's exactly what happens as the women depart from the tomb, carrying out the mission given them by the angel. Again, we meet the interjection for the extraordinary, idu, or behold. In the course of their journey, they're met by Jesus, who addresses them with the characteristic greeting, chayrete, translated as hail, or greetings. It's the greeting of the angel to Mary at the Annunciation in the Gospel of Luke. Ironically, it's also the greeting used by Judas as he betrayed Jesus in the garden in Matthew 26:49. So the women who had heard from the angel that Jesus was raised now stand face to face with the risen Jesus. The reality of the resurrection was confirmed by their own eyes. The women's reaction to the sight clearly shows that they recognize who Jesus is. But they also recognize something more about him. Taking hold of the feet is a sign in the culture of the day of obeisance to a ruler or a king, expressing submission. This, linked with the use of the verb proskuneo, which is used to designate worship, implies that they now recognize that he's more than a mere human. Jesus now reiterates the assurance of the angel, "Do not be afraid," and then himself gives the women the message and the mission that the angel had given them. "Go and tell my brothers," that is, the disciples, "that they are to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." The way is now prepared for the meeting of Jesus and his disciples in Galilee, in which he will give them the Great Commission and then depart from them. Having narrated the mission of the women as delivered by the angel, Matthew now returns to the guards. When the angel departs, they regain their senses and realize that Jesus is not in the tomb. And so they must now account for their allowing such a thing to happen. This section is linked to the preceding section on the women by the clause, "while they were going." In other words, the guard approaches the chief priests as the women are on their way to the disciples after encountering the risen Lord. Again, the unit is introduced by the interjection of unusual occurrence, idu. "Behold, some of the guard went to the city to tell the chief priests all that had happened." The chief priests, in response, assemble. They assemble the elders and the council. Hagner notes that this is the last time in the Gospel of Matthew that the elders gather for council. However, they're really at a loss as to what they should do. All they can decide is to bribe the soldiers. That is, give them enough money, telling them to tell the people that Jesus' disciples came by night and stole the body while they were asleep. This forms an inclusion with the same elders giving Judas an amount of money to betray Jesus. The irony of this plan is that the very thing for which the elders begged Pilate to give them soldiers to prevent, by setting a guard on the tomb, is the story that they circulate to explain the empty tomb. There is a further irony in that if they were doing their job for which they were at the tomb rather than sleeping, they would have seen what had happened. How can one sleep through an earthquake and a rather large stone being rolled back? To preclude any repercussions from their negligence, the elders assure the soldiers that if the governor hears anything of this, they will speak with him and make things easy for the soldiers, keeping them out of trouble. How this is to be accomplished, we're not told. So the soldiers take the bribe money and did as they were directed, placing the blame for the stolen body squarely on the shoulders of the disciples. And that's the story that has still spread among the Jews up to the day of Matthew. We have further evidence that the story was being circulated among the Jews well into the 2nd century from the writings of St. Justin, who wrote in the middle of the 2nd century. The soldiers who came before the elders expecting to be reprimanded, and perhaps even reported to Pilate, depart wealthier men, who only have to tell a story to all who ask. They escaped punishment and got off easy. The only part of the story that remains is the meeting of the disciples with Jesus in Galilee. That's the topic of this, the final unit in the Gospel of Matthew, also known as the Great Commission, as Jesus passes on to his disciples the mission that had been his, and he returns to the Father in the Ascension. The disciples follow the command given by Jesus through the women, and they travel north to Galilee. This is one of the only times that they're referred to as the 11 rather than the 12. But as we know, Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, committed suicide in the course of the Passion narrative, leaving 11. Hagner notes that Matthew, in placing this commission narrative in Galilee, brings his narrative of Jesus' ministry full circle. It reaches its conclusion in Galilee, the very place where it began. The 11 thus make their way to the mountain to which Jesus directed them. In the previous units of the Gospel, however, there's no direction to meet him at a specific mountain. Only he will go before them in Galilee. Thus, we should go along with Harrington, who notes the speculation on this particular mountain is pointless. In Galilee, when they encounter the risen Lord, their reaction is twofold. They worshipped him, pros ekinoson, that is, they gave him the homage due to a deity. But as most translations say, there were also some who doubted. Now, the translation doubt for the verb distadzo is really not an accurate one. The verb distadzo has the sense of hesitation or indecision between two alternatives. It's the reaction one might have when one recognizes another, but deep down they feel that it cannot possibly be. Sort of, is it or isn't it? They were in a state of cognitive dissonance par excellence. Then Jesus lets them know that despite all that has happened in the past days, the relationship they had with him has not been hurt. Perhaps to reassure their hesitation, his words are critical. He begins with a reference to what he has done in the gospel and why he has done it. All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. It's that authority that allowed him to perform wondrous deeds and to eloquently preach the mission of the kingdom. Now, as he prepares to depart them, he gives that authority to the 11 with a command, a commission. Going, therefore, make disciples of all nations. They're to continue his mission of bringing the good news of the kingdom, now not to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but to all nations. Then the means of doing that is outlined in two further participles. They are to baptize in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. This is the first time that we see the three persons of what will be defined as the Trinity mentioned together. Perhaps that's a reference to the baptismal formula of Matthew's community. It certainly is a prefigurement of the baptismal formula that we use today. The final part of the commission takes the form of yet another participle, which gives the second means whereby they're to make disciples, teaching them to observe all that they have been commanded. In other words, they're to pass on to those they evangelize the teaching of Jesus. And then Jesus makes a final promise. Lo, again that idu, I am with you always to the close of the age. This notion of with you forms yet another inclusion in the gospel text. In the Annunciation narrative to Joseph, in the opening chapter, Jesus, in fulfillment of the prophet Isaiah, is to be called Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Thus, Jesus in his ministry was God made present to the people to whom he ministered. Now, in this final scene, Jesus, who is ascending to the Father, will not leave his church alone. He will be with them always, even to the end. Hagner puts it well. He will be in their midst, though unseen, and will empower them to fulfill the commission he has given them. And thus ends the Gospel of Matthew. As a result of this study, let us always be cognizant of the presence of Jesus in our midst, and bring that knowledge and experience of that presence to others.